Oh, thank you all for returning to the conference. We are running late by half an hour. We have two sessions now before we break for coffee, following which we'll have the final session of the conference. I'll invite Dr. Sukanya Sarbadhikary to chair this conference. Dr. Sukanya Sarbadhikary is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Presidency University. She works at the interfaces of the anthropology of religion, anthropology of embodiment, religious studies, and philosophy. Sukanya, please come here, and we will finish this session at 3.
Good afternoon. This session promises to be a very exciting one, and it's very humbling to chair this session since I have learned a great deal from and continue to learn every day from Professor Prathama Banerjee and Professor Bodhisattva. Prathama Banerjee is a historian at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. She works at the cusp of intellectual history, political philosophy, and literary studies. From understanding heterotemporalities to asking whether the subaltern is a political subject or protagonist of history, to ask, and of course in her 2020 book with the obvious titular Echo, Elementary Aspects of the Political Histories from the Global South, her engagements with notions of subalternity have been constant and incisive. Bodhisattva teaches history at the University of Cape Town, and his writing and pedagogic engagements with post-coloniality generally and peasantry, tribalism, and the frontier specifically also constantly speak to subaltern studies. It's my absolute honor and pleasure to invite both of them on the dais. We will first hear Professor Prathama Banerjee, whose talk today is titled The Archaic, the Modern, and the Untimely, the Many Temporalities of Subaltern Studies.
Thank you very much, Shohini, Shourabh, and Upal and Sukanya of making me part of this very moving and meaningful occasion for me personally. I'll dive straight into it. So in this presentation, I discuss Ranajit Guha's thoughts on time as they evolved in the wake of his historiographical innovations. Critiquing nationalist and Marxist historiographies for rendering the subaltern into a pre-modern and pre-political subject of history, Guha tasked the subaltern studies with fashioning a new archival method and a new representational technique that could render the subaltern present to modernity. Soon, however, this search for a new historical method came up against the limits of history itself, as Guha went on to demonstrate academic history's complicity in colonial epistemologies that underlay the violent, modernizing logic of the post-colonial developmental state. While much has been written about Guha's historical innovations, the politics of time implicit in his scholarship could do with a little more attention. It is my contention that an important aspect of Guha's work is his attempt to phenomenologically think through the question of heterogeneous temporalities through the deployment first of anthropological insights and then poetics, thereby opening to radical contestation not only the discipline of history, but also prevalent conceptions of modernity and contemporaneity. The first volume of the Subaltern Studies began with Ranajit Guha's manifesto on the need to recover autonomous subaltern politics from the prison of elite historiography. That the question of time was implicit in his understanding of subaltern autonomy becomes clear immediately after, when Guha goes on to say that subaltern political practices can be traced back to pre-colonial traditions, which colonial modernity failed to render ineffective. Unlike pre-colonial elite politics, which quickly became anachronistic. Subaltern politics displayed greater depth in time, his words, and produced new forms and content from out of older traditions. The autonomous subaltern was thus present, efficacious, and yet somewhat untimely. This understanding that the subaltern subject embodied a kind of temporal alterity at the heart of the modern flew in the face of progressivist historiography, which depended on the idea of historical transition. As we know, the transition debate dominated the Indian academia in the 1970s and 80s, when historians and economists ceaselessly debated whether there was feudalism in India's past, or if colonial subordination meant that India was already subsumed under capitalism without having industrialized, or whether colonialism itself could be conceived of as a distinctive mode of production unforeseen by Marx, and so on. The transition imaginary also informed debates about the nature of the post-colonial nation state, as political theorists deployed the Gramscian notion of passive revolution to argue that the Indian state operated via a class settlement between modern capitalists and pre-modern feudal landlords, thus holding up a proper bourgeois democratic transition in India. Writing in 2008 on Indian democracy and economic transformation, Partho Chatterjee identified the transition mentality as the bugbear of India's 20th century academic thinking. Now, the very year that Subaltern Studies 2 was published, Ranajit Guha published his elementary aspects, in which he strenuously objected to the image of the pre-political peasant rebel that denied critical acumen to subaltern insurgents. Guha's alternative, and though somewhat structuralist reading of subaltern political acumen, which he called consciousness, as we know, cited longer traditions of power and protest in the subcontinent. Just as colonial power deployed ancient idioms of dharma, danda, and bhakti, Guha said, insurgent peasants too drew upon longer traditions of rebellion, hing, bidroho, ulgulan, hul, fituri, etc., mobilizing idioms of duty, sacrifice, and an ethically enjoined imperative to resist kingly power run amok. These non-modern forms of power and protest, he argued, combined with colonial modern forms in ways to produce an analytical and organizational acumen amongst peasants that belied the idea that subaltern insurgency was a kind of eruption which had no impact on the movement of historical time. Guha's elementary aspects, unsurprisingly, is beset by a tension between Guha's residual transitionist sensibility and his desire to reanimate heterogeneous temporalities of peasant lives. This comes through in his repeated statements that objective conditions prevented subaltern politics from coming into its own, even as he filled his footnotes thickly with citations from pre-colonial texts and traditions, including, to a great extent, Manav Dharma Shastra, Manusmriti. The epigraph with which elementary aspect begins, you might recall, is an extract from the 3rd, 2nd century BCE Buddhist text Majjhima Nikaya, which cites the Buddha as invoking the future possibility of masters becoming slaves and slaves masters. According to Guha, and we know this well enough for me to dwell on it, the operation of other times at the heart of the modern present was the direct result of the nature of modern colonialism, which, being dominance without hegemony, failed to render extinct longer histories of thinking and acting on the world. In 1985, Guha wrote a remarkable essay called The Carrier of an Anti-God in Heaven and Earth. The beginning of the essay is worth citing. I quote, "Religion is the oldest archives of our subcontinent. All the principal moments of the ancient relationship of dominance and subordination are recorded in it as codes of authority, collaboration, and resistance, expressed in myth, cult, ritual, and custom, and their permutations, shrouded often in mystic sentiments, obscure symbols, modified by accretion and decay. It does not allow itself to be grasped as lucidly as law. Elliptical and syncopated, it suffers incomprehensibility. Presumably, it's the task of the subaltern historian to be able to read the syncopated nature and decayed nature of this old archive, as it were. Guha begins this essay by extensively citing the Marxist historian D.D. Kosambi, who famously used ethnographic techniques to recover older histories from material traces in the contemporary. Guha, as you know, then went on to read and reread the old myth of the anti-god Rahu, the malevolent force which swallows the sun and the moon and causes universal pollution on Earth, in its diverse retellings from the far past to the present, in order to stage the shifting contours of what he called the ancient and unresolved antagonism between Brahmins and outcasts and creditors and debtors. In his early work, thus, it seems to me, Guha's thinking about temporality appears to be founded on a kind of anthropological attunement to traces of the past which are alive in the present. This also comes through in the central place given to the Adivasi in his elementary aspects, even though he somewhat problematically glossed forest peoples universally as peasants. Soon, however, Guha made a decisive move from anthropology to literature, which reoriented his thinking of time. Initially, this move was mediated by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's intervention in the subaltern studies. Spivak glossed Guha's counterintuitive readings of the historical archive as an unwitting instance of the literary practice of deconstruction. However, while Spivak urged Guha to give up on his imagination of the subaltern as an immediate historical subject, fully amenable to representation and imbued with the metaphysics of presence, Guha's own work actually took a very different direction. His critique, first of historiography and then history, instead of taking him from the subject to the text, returned him to an imagination of a refigured self in the world as the prime conduit for the unfolding of being and time, as it were, which is why his abiding interest in both Rabindranath and Heidegger. We see glimpses of this already in his efforts to refigure the subaltern from community to singularity in his essay Chandra's Death. Edward Said, in his preface to the 1988 volume of Selected Subaltern Studies essays, saw Guha, interestingly, as belonging to a long list of post-colonial novelists and poets. Salman Rushdie, Marquez, Alatas, Fez, it's a very long list, and Guha figures in that list of poets and novelists. Guha himself began his 1998 essay entitled Conquest Foretold by citing Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Here, he contrasted conquest, which he glossed as an instant of absolute aggression, sans futurity, to rule, which, by deploying the apparent perpetuity of law, refigured conquest as always already foretold, that is subject to historical necessity. Colonial historiography did precisely this, he argued, namely gloss conquest as an event in history rather than as a visitation upon history that disrupted chronology itself. In a 2008 essay on time in a colonial city, Guha described the urban everyday of the colony as a present from which there is no exit, a present with neither anteriority nor futurity. He did this by contrasting the narrative strategies of two contemporary parodies, Charles Dickens's Sketches by Bose and Kali Prashanna Singho's Hutum Pachar Noksha. Again, I am tempted to cite Guha directly. I quote, "The historicist imperative is conspicuous by its absence in Hutum Pachar Noksha. That is not to suggest that it is ahistorical. The Noksha affirms its historicality by deploying time in a manner strikingly different from the Sketches of Bose. The Sketches of Bose traces its way back from the day-to-day of urban life to connect itself by a linear nexus to the past. The actual, assimilated thus to the bygone, adds to its density, the past's density. And the shards of broken lives picked up from the back streets of London are fitted ingeniously into the tale of England's expansion overseas. Nothing could be more different from the temporal strategy of the Naksha, based on a total involvement with the present, which instead of being overtaken by the past, does the overtaking itself. The past is by no means left out, but no sooner does it make its appearance than it is absorbed into the ongoing surge of the present. The aspect of light, the present, or Vartaman, contrasted in Indian thought and language with the more obscure aspects of the past and the future, affirms its authority by letting the characteristic day-to-day of urban life disclose themselves. For, and Guha cites Bhartrihari here, the present is a path that is like light itself. Vartamano adva prakasavat. So by now, Guha has clearly moved from insurgency to the everyday. But it is important to note that Guha's everyday was different from the everyday proposed by James Scott in his Weapons of the Weak, a book that made waves almost at the same time as the Subaltern studies. While Scott's everyday was recovered anthropologically, Guha insisted that the everyday was not directly accessible to either anthropology or history. Anthropology rendered the everyday into wonderless habit and routine, and history subsumed the everyday under the biography of the state. In 2000, Guha's lectures on history at the limit of world history argue that European traditions worked with a fear of the destructive capacity of time, and hence displayed an utter dependence on the state's sovereign capacity to stabilize time's vicissitudes. In Europe's origin myth, Kronos devoured his own children and had to be tamed by the kingly power of Zeus, a story that came to be sublimated in Hegel's idea of the state as the ultimate embodiment of a self-actualizing spirit. In Indic traditions, however, Guha added, time was understood as a creative force that brought the world into being in the very same way as did the poet. Which is why, as David Shulman has argued in his 2012 book on the history of imagination in India, tellingly titled More Than Real, the term bhava, denoting poetic efficacy, derived from the root word bhu, that denoted the world, bhuvan, as existent. Guha then goes on to contrast the genres of history and novel to the genres of katha and kavya to argue that while the former grounded time and truth in the stable self-identity of the author's own experience, the latter privileged the listener who initiated a cycle of retellings, not by claiming to have an experience of or being a witness of other times, but out of a sense of wonder at a time not his own. In the Indic tradition, thus, the presence of other times was predicated on the mutually entangled expressive labor of the poet and the active and attuned desire of the listener. Between poet and audience, author and reader, the self gets to be a distributed rather than a self-same entity, an author, an autonomous or sovereign author. In his 2009 Bengali book, Kobir Naam Sharbonam, Guha went on to further elaborate on this figure of this creative self as other than the figure of the historical subject. Through a reading of early Indian grammatical and aesthetic traditions, invoking Panini, Bhartrihari Bhavabhuti, and Rabindranath in one breath, historically as if they are contemporaries, Guha interpreted the play of the mutually entangled first and second person pronouns in poetry, the I and the you, as undercutting the contextually overdetermined subject position of the proper noun, the name, the authorial subject. The play of the I and the you, he argued, generalized and socialized the self in the world by the aesthetic imperative of Shadharanikaran, which comes from older rasa theory and such like, and enabled an overreach, utkranti, he calls it, which I would pause before translating into transcendence, utkranti, an overreach of historical context and a leap, an imaginative leap into other times and other places, a capacity that Rabindranath mobilized in his critique of nationalism and his embrace of the world at large. In what way is Guha's move from history to historicality to temporality predicated upon his initial quest for the subaltern? I don't think we have a very clear answer to that question. My sense is that Guha continues to struggle with the time of the modern state. And if we remember, he came into public view primarily through his writings against emergency and the crisis of democracy that developmentalism brought to India. Guha continues to struggle with the time of the modern state and its claim to perpetual sovereignty irrespective of all changes in regimes of power. And we are taught that governments change, but the state remains, a form of eternity, which many would call the political theology of a monotheistic God. So I think he's struggling against the idea of sovereign perpetuum, which is at the heart of Western European political philosophy. In his book, 2013, called Prem Na Protarana, Love or Betrayal, Guha speaks of the temporality of the promise, the ultimate guarantee of the future, the promise of the future, as is development, as is modernity. Through a reading of the stories of Antigone and King Creon and Sita and King Rama, Guha argues that the promise of law, positive law, state's law, as guaranteeing the future of a people rests on the betrayal of another promise, namely the forever of erotic and filial love, of kinship. It is the story of that other betrayed promise on which stands the promise of a future guaranteed, that takes us from history to poetry. Perhaps, and I'm merely speculating here, Guha is implying that we attend to the temporality of a betrayed promise in order to sense the subaltern via a poetics of loss, impossibility, rather than a historical recovery of presence, which is at the heart of modern representative politics and its identitarian iterations in today's time. Thank you.
Okay, I'll skip the first part, which was purely personal. So from insurgency to the everyday through the spectrum of the subaltern's untimely being, as I derive some meaning from that fascinating talk, we move to Bodhisattva. Yes, Bodhida.
Thank you. Always a hard act to follow. Well, first of all, thank you. Saurabh, Shohini, and all the other members of Bhabuk Sabha who have made this possible. And Upal and Sukanya for being the generous hosts they are, and they're becoming kind of frighteningly professional at this. Tochan Ghosh will have a tough time. Okay. The title of this paper is, it's not a paper, but whatever it is Ranajit Guha and the Fading Histories of Structuralism. For those of us who did not have a ringside view of the making of early subaltern studies, I like to think that we have, or at least we must demand, some freedom of decision about how we want to put the story together. The story that is Ranajit Guha. For much too long, and Ishitadi briefly brought up this point yesterday, the strong tendency in the critical industry for placing the early subaltern studies works neatly within the British tradition of history from below eventuated a dominant association of the project with that of recovering the subject. That was indeed, many of you will remember the title of Rosalind O'Hanlon's essay in Modern Asian Studies in 1988. Even if already in 85, Spivak had pointed at the facileness of such a description and offered an infinitely more nuanced and productive alternative, that association has stuck with the writers and readers of 101 historiography textbooks. This is, of course, not unrelated to the fact of subaltern studies' impressive, even if initially somewhat unforeseen, transnational success, which in turn, and this order, this sequence is critical to bear in mind, paved the way for its slow, halting, and often Pyrrhic institutional victories in Indian universities. As the term subaltern began to gain acceptance among professional historians and graduate students across the country and abroad to represent any and every cause of social and political injustice, from the 2000s, it's all epistemic, by the way. It not only became easier, but also necessary, this is my argument, to sidestep some of Guha's original challenges to the recuperative projects or renewed forms of homespun humanism. Almost 10 years ago, in a similar event at CSDS Delhi, celebrating the 30 years of elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India, Dipesh Chakraborty offered a few important correctives to this mainstream story of a seamless convergence between history from below and subaltern studies. One of his important reminders being the deliberate refusal of Guha of the individuating trick of British radical history of drawing the faces in the crowd, so to speak. Guha called these historians with much disdain the practitioners of the gentle art of prosopography. Chakraborty said that this methodological decision made room in South Asian history for the first time for a certain figuration of subject position that could be collective but evanescent. That's his phrase. And for Chakraborty, this methodological decision of Guha was historically possible because in elementary aspects, Guha could find an answer to the question of the everyday experience of the heterogeneity of time in South Asia that Prathama just so eloquently spoke about in structuralism, right? So on an aside to the students in the room, Chakraborty's presentation is available on the CSDS YouTube channel. You can check it out. And of course, Professor Partha Chatterjee's Princeton keynote address, delivered around the same time and published in EPW after Subaltern Studies, is also make some of the same points and refers to Chakraborty's address. Look that up. So this is where I want to start from today. Taking this set of observations as my point of departure, what I want to embark on is a rather arcane exercise, which I have no doubt will seem even wrong-headed to many in the room. But I just want to put together a very small, tiny story of Guha's structuralism, which is always already a history of its forgetting. There is obviously, like everyone else, and Projit has been teasing me about this for a bit, an autobiographical element to this choice. And I should be upfront about it. As a member of the academic generation, to whom Guha's outsider to the academic status was by no means self-evident, as we were among the first having to write answers for wretched tutorial and exam questions on Guha's work, both in Presidency and in JNU. I have a particular interest in putting together this story. As students in the 1990s, we used to joke that structuralism was the Eugene Düring of our intellectual training. Just as we all read Engels's invective against the now obscure anti-Semitic socialist, anti-Düring, right? But never the man's own work. The intellectual and institutional arrangements of the 1990s ensured that as students, we were, for example, given to read Derrida's polemic with Levi-Strauss without ever having to read Levi-Strauss. Of all the routes that the elementary aspects has opened for me and continues to open, the ones that have proved most enduring, intriguing, treacherous, and exciting lay through Guha's deployment and defacement of the formalist and structuralist writers, such as Roman Jakobson, Emil Benveniste, and Claude Levi-Strauss. If this fascination originated in the arbitrariness of the curricula that I was formally raised in, it has become both my way of making sense of a global historiographical conversation that is not immediately legible in standard accounts, and an object of research to the extent that I'm currently trying to write a history of the footnotes of 2 chapters in Levi-Strauss's Elementary Structures of Kinship. Rereading Guha, or should I say pre-Canberra Guha, this is a conversation I think we should have at some point in this symposium, in a time that often appears to my confused mind as a time of identitarian counter-revolution, allows me to remember structuralism in a way, in a particular way, that was never authorized for my memory by my institutions. I must clarify that what I have to say is not a commentary on custody battles between formalism and structuralism, or for that matter, between structuralism and phenomenology, nor am I going to go into, defining structuralism once and for all. And certainly this is the farthest from a comprehensive account of Guha's engagement with this style of thought. Time is limited, lunch was good. I will just concentrate on one particular piece of writing that I have not seen any analyst of Guha engaging at length. And we'll pick up on some particular threads of this text to indicate, to illustrate both Guha's coming to structuralism and the forms in which structuralism intimated itself in Guha's corpus. The text is called Knowing India by Its Prisms. It's a 5-page book review published in Frontier of October 1977. The book Guha writes about was the book that Guha writes about was quite sensational at this time, and in fact is still well known, whether through Spivak's celebrated essay on Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi, or through its multiple quotations and readaptations in a growing and still inadequate historical and sociological literature on Indian prisons. Is Srila here today? She was here yesterday. She has done a very nuanced reading of the text in her work on sexual politics of Naxalbari, or through this book's recent copious invocations by the mainstream media during Kobad Gandhi's arrest in 2009. Mary Tyler's My Years in an Indian Prison, an autobiographical account of the author's 5 years in the jails of Chaibasha, Hazaribagh, and Jamshedpur. Tyler, a young British teacher, came to India along with her Indian husband, Amolendu Sen, at the end of 1969, became active in a Naxalite formation in the Ruam jungles, and was soon detained and arrested by the police on charges of extremist violence. It's a book she published after she finished her term in jails and was deported. Characteristically, Guha invites us to approach the book in terms of a deceptively simple question. Tyler has spent not even 2,000 days in India. And even, he calculates at the beginning, 93% of this time was spent in lockups and jails. So I quote, "How possibly could anyone so unfamiliar with India acquire so truthful a view of our country under such conditions? How did she come to know the life of our people so well when all she saw of it was prison life?" Brilliant opening for epistemology in action, right? Stoking the first doubt about experience, or at least about our tea-stall variety of expectations from experience, about inside, outside. Guha finds the answer to his own question, as he puts it, at 2 levels. The first is the subjective level, but first let me just put up the excerpts. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, in whatever manner I try to restate this beautiful, sharp, sardonic, crisp prose, I'll make a mess. So just keep your eye on the screen as we try and get a drift of Guha's style of argument. So it starts with Tyler's description of her solitary confinement, right? And then Guha, go to the next. Then Guha disaggregates look at the red stuff, the punitive condition along the axis of language, while they're both denied the right to communicate, right? The native and the foreign prisoner. The former can at least find umbrage in the overheard phonemes, words, and strings of constituents of a familiar language that mediate illicitly between him and a forbidden word. No such secret bridges span the silence that separates the alien detainee from the others. Can we have it back? Thank you. And then he telescopes the linguistic, well, into nothing. Then he telescopes the linguistic to the semiotic, as you can see. Talks about an alternative set of signifiers, alphabets, the ground under our feet. alphabets of a language without frontiers, the language of nature. But of course, Guha has very little patience for such a 16th century trope. The fleeting poeticity, this is beautifully written, as you can see, a rising moon, an owl on a rooftop, and the silhouette of people trees glimpsed through the prison bars emerge as an alternative set of signifiers. Right? It's that pure Guha. And that fleeting poeticity is immediately inverted by the deliberate action of the communicating subject. Go to the next slide, please. Right. Solitary confinement had thus pushed her nearly to the outermost limit of society, beyond the last familiar signpost in any language known to her. Here she might easily have stepped into that no man's land where human communication yields to its mocking negation, the language of nature. But it is precisely at this critical verge that Mary Tyler turned around and fought her way back into the world of incomprehensible noise that was India. If we note, keep reading this, if we note what Guha is choosing to note from Tyler's account, the twig and the dust, the gestures, the inseparability of verbal and non-verbal communication, I hope we can all begin to see why I'm urging to read this particular piece as a first draft of elementary aspects. I'm obviously exaggerating here, but my point is that although the political content of this piece is quite closely aligned with that famous and poignant 1971 essay on torture and culture, with this text, Guha takes a turn from that largely Fanonian framework and begins to work at the many blurring frontiers of language. This is not yet the full-fledged Barthian analysis of the prose of counterinsurgency, on which Nishant focused yesterday. And I must mention in public how much I'm in agreement with Nishant's reading. But this is a history of an experience of knowing. And in that precise sense, it contains certain methodological clues to what Saurabh called it this morning, the structuralist sensibilities of elementary aspects. So to return to the story, Tyler picked up enough Hindi and Bengali to supplement and even substitute the non-verbal communication. But the acquisition of an empirical language, Guha now insists, is not enough. Please go to the next one. And he says this, one can know a language and yet not know the life of the people who speak it. Language in such cases is reduced to a mere fact-gathering gadget. It is the relation between those facts which constitutes the truth about a society. This relation may elude even some native speakers. Hence, the total incomprehension characteristic of our ruling classes, and he goes into a tirade against Indira Gandhi and talks about how this is symptomatic of an inevitable and pathological incapacity to know. And in order to illustrate this, he kind of juxtaposes that recently unseated Indira Gandhi's interview with Tyler's efforts to reformat her own conduct in conformity with the conventions of her adopted speech community. A paragraph also contains a dash of Freud, referencing not exactly thought through comments on overdetermination of Tyler's dream images, etc. But his main point is sympathy. Without sympathy, what he calls a sort of language of the soul, no empirical language can be enough for knowing. This is kind of the main argument at this part. And as Parthoda was mentioning yesterday, to one version of this argument, Guha will return more elaborately 3 decades later in Daya, right? I will not go there, although I have things to say about that. But I will remember that one of Guha's favorite texts is the study of Baudelaire's Cats, jointly carried out by Roman Jakobson and Claude Lévi-Strauss. And contrary to the hackneyed depiction of structuralist language as schematic, that text proceeds wonderfully through a series of oppositions, right? Passivity, activity, meso, sazo, quartets, tercets, proximal, distal, exterior stanzas, interior stanzas, to offer a figurative integration which is necessarily undercut by its own semantic ambiguity between the female and the feline. In the theoretical architecture of this review, Guha's sympathy, too, is not autonomous. And this is, I think, where the difference with the later kind of argument that comes with historicality and more philological notion of language, etymologically charged philological notion, the kind that Prathama was giving examples of. I think his interest in language is definitely is one thread that runs through his entire corpus, but the notion of language he's working with is very different. And I think that affects the argument of sympathy here and the kind of opposition of Bahubal and Daya in the book Daya. But so sympathy is not autonomous. It is part of the pair, empirical language and language of the soul. In fact, the more we read on, the structuralist distributions of the operations that Barth used to call levels, levels of functions, levels of actions, levels of narration, begins to reveal itself in a rather chillingly hidden but thought out manner. And he specifically, towards the end, he specifically speaks of the binary signal of a grimace and a smile. This, if you remember that earlier quote where this girl in the prison used to smile, and I didn't read that part out, but you might have noticed that on the screen. Before she knew the language, this other girl would smile at Tyler and when they couldn't communicate verbally, and then she would turn and would look with a grimace to the warden, right? So that's how she made terrible and fine. That's the argument. The structuralist grammar of the making of a revolutionary subject. And this is why I'm trying to say that why Mao Zedong has to complete the loop with Barth and Benveniste in the prose of countergency. There's a history to that. And sympathy by itself could hardly be an aid to knowing a country by its prison if prisons were simply the institutions they claim to have been. Guha argues that according to the legalist account, the life of the prison must be the very antithesis of the life of society, right? And therefore logically should be a poor guide to one's understanding of the latter. And yet Tyler gets it right. How can she? And it is here that Guha sees the grounds for rejecting the theory of ideal prisons in an ideal state, right? And he calls them Calvinistic and so on. And who does he enlist the service of? Michel Foucault. And Foucault's term, the carceral network. Guha's first, this is 1977, Guha's first and only reference to Foucault until Chandra's death. An article to come exactly in 10 years' time. And with Foucault's analytic, the original epistemological fissure, how did she come to know the life of our people so well when all she saw of it was prison life, develops into a full-scale commentary on knowing under constraints, right? Could you go to the next one, please? I'll not read this out, but the typical Foucault Marxism stuff. So the kind of confoundment that Foucault saw prison producing in a society, right? Because in all essential respects, the relationship between the prison authorities and the prison population is the same as that between our rulers and our people. That's the argument. So, and that's why he talks about that how the prison actually produces an organic society within the prison, not a decomposed society. And if you read that in parallel with the kind of the immediacy and the secondary argument, secondary story in prose of counterinsurgency, you can see that he's kind of beginning to at least pave the way to think like that. So, but we can go on. But why am I doing this? Why am I taking you through an obscure review published in 1977 and talking about structuralism and kind of claiming that this is where it happened? Because I think, I I would like to hold on for a moment to the double concurrence of the carceral form and the communicative system. This, I mean, obviously what we are thinking about here, the inter-criticism of language, you know, Nietzsche's famous phrase, language, prison house of language, right? And often structuralism has been criticized for its limiting view, etc. You all know the drill. What I'm trying to say is that this kind of empirical coincidence and a theoretical fissure, this is an important part of the plot of my story of Guha's coming to structuralism. To me, it is significant because with this kind of unauthorized genealogies, we might be able to think the theoretical career of structuralism in the global south otherwise than the highbrow French gossip of François Dosset or François Cousset would allow, right? I mean, understandably, I'm leaning more towards works like Camille Robsis's Law of Kinship, but I think, you know, the whole idea that there is this history of structuralism, and that's something of a bigger project that I'm involved on. I'm trying to imagine, trying to work my way through, is that not simply the Althusserian structuralism, but also the Levi-Straussian, and there's been many myths and many kind of flippant ways of dismissing this as a conservatism of the left, as something that was just high theory and depoliticized, etc. In the literal prison house of 1970s, right, this encounter, and if this indeed the kind of genealogy I'm suggesting, kind of obviously mimicking later Guha, kind of parodying later Guha, finding the origin. What I'm trying to say, that not only can we find a different way about thinking of agency and limit, but also imagine a different global genealogy of structuralism. Why, and connect it with the kind of current work that is happening in different parts, which are talking about why negritude networks are interested in structuralism. Why does it make so much sense to some of the Brazilian anti-colonial thinkers? And that's my revenge against my syllabus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From yesterday to today, we now have a very different kind of relation that's being established between language and experience and the prison and the world outside or inside. I'll quickly open up the session for questions and answers. We have about 10 to 12 minutes to wrap the session up. So we'll take one round of questions. I'd request you to be brief, please.
Thank you very much, Prathama and Bodhi, for scintillating. You were fantastic. No? You can't hear? Okay, no, I just thanked you for scintillating papers. They're fabulous. I just had a suggestion, actually, for Bodhi. You know, an aspect of structuralism which hasn't been examined is its deep relationship actually going to aesthetics and its entanglements with affect. Is one aspect which hasn't been seen is of structuralism as a project of modernism. And I mean modernism in its wider sense of aesthetics itself. I mean, there's something deeply, there's something deeply modernist about Levi-Strauss's text, for example, and the thing can be extended. And the break with structuralism, which comes in the forms of, in the manner of post-structuralism, where Roland Barthes, for example, as a definite aesthetic content. So I wonder if you'd want to just keep in view the aspects of modernism, its sensibilities, its structures, its textures, its sinews in the writings of Guha. So, but thank you very much both for papers which were different but which complemented each other.
I'm Shubhrima, UG2 Sociology. And I have questions for both Dr. Prathama Banerjee and Dr. Bodhisattva. So my first question to Dr. Prathama Banerjee is that you mentioned about the credit and debt power dynamics in your paper. So I was just thinking that how, like, what is the power relationship between credit and debtness in modern society, as in the modern institutions of giving credit like banks, and the relationship between the banks and corporates and governments, and also like Dr. Skaria yesterday told about the coercive truth and the vulnerable truth. So like in this context, which truth is the coercive truth and who owns the coercive truth? And for Dr. Kaur, in the slide, one of the slides, I guess slide 7, Ranajit Guha had written about the pathological incapacity to know. So is it like, I don't know if I'm getting it wrong, I might be getting it wrong, but is it like justifying the entire ruling class by saying that it's just pathological and it can be cured?
Bodhi, thank you very much for reminding us of this very old and almost forgotten review. But what you actually brought out brings up something which we often discussed and pondered about after Elementary Aspects was published. And we all became aware of the deeply structuralist framing of that book, including its title. But our sort of initial response to it was that why don't we try and just clean it up, remove those structuralist parts, and we would have a perfectly good and acceptable theory of peasant insurgency. But of course, we soon realized that that would really be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because in a sense, almost none of those elements and their essentially synchronic structuration, right? Without it, you would never have an account of the so-called insurgent present consciousness, right? That consciousness was really a synchronic structure. So how do you bring history into it and so on and so forth? That problem remains. Now, what you've brought out with this earlier iteration, when, as you say, I think I need to reread this essay to, in a sense, confirm what you're suggesting. I'm sure you're right. You've thought about it. That in fact he's already working with a certain implicitly structural framing in mind, but he is looking at questions which, now this is my question to you, which you suggest he returns in his late phase, right? After his sort of phenomenological turn into etymology, etc., all the Heidegger and so on. Do you think, in a sense, he is providing the answer that we never found, an answer to that initial question, without the structuralism. Are you suggesting that he finally landed there? And if not, why not? If not, why not? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for two marvelous papers. I have a very short question on structuralism, but I think in different ways both of you can respond to that. So I'm quoting Roland Barthes. The problem with structuralism is there isn't enough of it. And could you link that with the idea of the frontier and the limit in Guha's work? Thank you.
I can see just one other hand. Unless there are others, I will close with this question.
Thank you both. Wonderful. Lots to think through. Initial response, Prathamadi, I was thinking, as I got it, there seemed to be a journey you traced between, a Hegelian time, which maybe in a most systematic form getting critiqued by the use of Sharbonam and the Ami or I and you coupling, which then comes to Sadharanikaran, drawn from that. And it ends, I was thinking of asking you that when you end by returning to the question of time in terms of a history of loss. So how can we account for a project which still would be focused on the history of loss if you have gone through the kinds of heterogeneities that you have earlier traced? This is one issue that I was thinking of. Bodhida, you were making a critique of, I think, the way in which language has been discussed with reference to Guha so far in this conference. It's very valuable. If you are suggesting that there is a concurrence of the carceral and the linguistic, which you draw from this essay, then there seems to be already suggestively a self-reflexive position towards the use of semiotics. If I draw upon other suggestions drawn here, connecting not only prose of counterinsurgency, but maybe also elementary aspects. So if we think of a move from this essay to elementary aspects, and if there is this, quite radical critique in terms of having this concurrence of the carceral and the linguistic, then why doesn't the self-critique block the possible elaboration of this, engagement with language in elementary aspects? Just thinking about that.
Thank you very much for the questions. I wish we had more time today, but you have raised a very large question, and thank you for doing that, because I think one of the things that has been missing in our conversation over Upal and I were talking about this yesterday actually, is that we have not really brought the political economic question on the table, though clearly there is a substantial part of Guha's work which actually so I will not, I totally get where you're coming from in terms of a kind of shifted thinking that we have to deal with from the time when Guha thought about, colonialism, capitalism as kind of grounded in the question of So he was critiquing wage and profit as the binary through which one would read modern history, by returning the question to the question of the peasant, where clearly the question was of indebtedness and credit. And from that, a leap into our global contemporary, where it's almost universally accepted that surplus extraction is via interest far more than it is via profit, right? So you are thinking of a big arc which should be part of our conversation today, which we cannot for lack of time. But if I may suggest a book that I enjoyed reading a lot myself, it's a book by an anthropologist who's recently passed away, actually, called David Graeber, called Debt. And it's a kind of chronologically to and fro story of how the idea of debt has been differently thought across places and times. So and he kind of returns repeatedly the contemporary question of debt crisis and all that. So you'd enjoy it if you have a look at that. Upal, you're, actually I didn't know how the hell to end the paper. Sorry, I mean, that sounds, yeah. Basically, what the story I offered you is clearly my reconstruction. I'm quite sure Guha will not agree with some of the stuff that I'm trying to say. It's my reading of Guha's thing. And the question that I thought was important to raise was, how does one think through that arc from the subaltern to the self? I mean, there may be a relatively superficial way in which we can, it is the middle class Naxal come historian come communist activity, writing about the subaltern via a deconstruction of the self. That's the story of the tragic and ironic story of the Bengali middle class man, as we know, from the 60s and 70s. Oh, of course not you. You are a mountaineer. But but I'm just saying that I don't want to, that's too thin an explanation for all the labor that is put there. So I do want to ask the question of what's the connection between the question of the subaltern and the question of the self. And you're right, I think it's probably wrongly placed as a story of loss and absence, because then the heterogeneity gets lost. I take that point, and I think, well, I'll have to think about it a little more. Totally a point taken on that.
It's not necessarily an absence. No, I'm just saying, like, I think you're conceding far too much.
I think, nah. Yeah, I just have to, I'll just suspend the conclusion for the moment and just leave the question hanging for the moment. I just want to, the structuralism question is actually quite interesting and central. My reading of elementary aspects was exactly the fact that it's a text which is pulling in two directions. One is the structuralist imperative to give it this neat synchronicity, as Bartada is putting it rightly. And that's why his footnotes are so interesting. The footnotes are the footnotes of an ancient Indian historian. When I read the book first, when I was a student, I did notice stuff going on down there, but I didn't pay any attention. For me, it was peasant, revolution, consciousness, blah, blah, blah. But now that I've grown old, like Ranajit Guha, I pay more attention to the footnotes. And I think there is a massive heterogeneity between that running of the text, which is very clearly structuralist in its in its kind of, and the footnotes. So there is that tension between the synchronous and the dichronous already in elementary aspects. That's the way, which is why, Anushtup, your point, I mean, you hit it on the head by when we said that, the question of the limit and the frontier is not a structuralist's question. But then Guha feels compelled to return to it repeatedly. So maybe the structuralist question is actually something that he has been thinking about, but we have not understood that he is really thinking that. So yeah, maybe Bodhis has kind of caught the question precisely. Yeah, so just that.
Thank you. Shorata, the point about aesthetics and modernism is not only well taken, it's just making me think in all kinds of direction. And one of the things I want to connect it to something that I think is pertinent to a lot of the discussions we are having. And I'm very keen to have this discussion. You know, I mean, when we started the Marx reading group in this college, the whole thing was like early Marx, later Marx. This. So I would like to have like an early Guha, later Guha debate. And I've already shown my cards. So, why I'm saying this is because it's very interesting how his notion of modernist aesthetics also probably changes, right? And in a certain sense, that's why I was mentioning that Kat's poem and Levi-Strauss and Jakobson's kind of parsing of it. And if you think about that, that's also a certain kind of conduct of poeticity and how beauty, and they are making this absolutely vital argument, which definitely Guha loves, because he keeps quoting that article in different essays and even in elementary aspect, where he says that it is, of course, there's this arrangement, there's this mechanics, but there is also art. And we need to understand that art, how. And when he moves to Heidegger, and that whole notion of later Guha, like, I don't know, poeticity too, the later Guha poeticity is kind of, you know, it's the very, I don't know, reactionary modernism of Heidegger, where the idea is that the daily average is essentially bereft of poetry, and poeticity is something that interrupts and breaks that every day in that sense, which is not a kind of a Lefebvrean formulation, which is a very different notion of averageness. I don't know, I mean, I see a more recognizably democratic Guha in the previous one, and a more interesting, complex, but also kind of a little bit more. I worry about the second Guha a lot more than I worry about the first, but that's probably a lot more about my own position than Guha's. Yes. And yes, until probably you know, decoloniality started. So now I do mourn for the progressive that we all critiqued.
Perhaps straddling the early and the later Guha is, you know, this is something which you haven't done. Perhaps it's about approaching Guha himself as a modernist, right? I mean, the structuralism, post-structuralism, but it's not about whether it unites. It's Guha as the craftsperson. It's Guha as the author. It's, you know, Guha as the modernist. So perhaps it's the aesthetics and politics of modernism, which is itself a deeply contradictory move. I think, you know, that might be the way in which we can. And, you know, so I'd asked the question to you about structuralism, and then I said, oh, actually, that question goes to Prathama as well. So, this interruption.
Shubhrima, you asked about the incapacity. No, then I must have misrepresented. What she actually say is that, you know, that Indira Gandhi in this interview, she said that she was deposed, she lost precisely because her intelligence service failed her, right? So what Guha is saying that this is the typical instrumentalist understanding of language. Of course, they know the empirical language, so they can gather the news, but they don't have that language of the soul. They don't know what the experience of the people are, right? So that's why so just with the empirical language, you can never actually know, right? And precisely because the state is not interested in having the language of the soul, or sympathy, as he calls it, right? That's what it is, kind of almost, it's ingrained in its structure. That incapacity is ingrained in its structure. It's, you know, Guha of 77 would never do that. Those kind of certainties I like increasingly more. Patula. No, I don't think, you know, obviously I can't answer this, and I have to actually talk to you to get out of the mess that I've brought myself in. But what I want to push, And I would like to hear if you have anything to say on that. I don't think he returns. I think this is a concern that he has, but I do think that this is why I brought up the question of sympathy being a pair, part of a pair, an opposition. I think that kind of notion of a kind of a structuralist Marxist almost, because he also even talks about supersession and kind of a Hegelian overcoming in different places while he's using this, right? So that kind of stuff, I think it just drops that dyadic structure once that kind of philological, etymological language. And that's why I was saying that the kind of notion of language he's operating with in the 70s and maybe even in the mid 80s is definitely not the late 80s, 89, 90 kind of idea of language. And I do think the interesting thing is that Panini, that we encounter in elementary aspects is essentially a mask of Saussure. It's essentially kind of Saussure. His real interest is actually in word theory, like when he actually is talking about, and that's where, and there's I mean, Nishant is way more competent to speak about that, but I think there is a politics there as well, like not talking about Panini and talking more about word theory, which kind of, you know, the whole idea of this ontological status of sound. Well, I like the Guha who in 1977 would have said that is idealist, you know, and he wouldn't say that in 89. So I don't think they're operating the same. But the rest of it, you know, I'm kind of both relieved and further excited and puzzled. So thank you for your contribution. Ratul, the structuralism and limit, I don't know if I have anything to add. I would just say this, that it's also kind of an interesting way how it is becoming increasingly more hermeneutic in Guha over the years, right? And the limit then almost begins to become, rather than the limit question in the original sense of transgression, etc., it begins to become almost a horizon in Gadamer kind of sense. So I would just note that move without making any other comment. And I think about Upal's question, you know, why it doesn't block the next elaboration, because it is not simply critique. That is the great thing about structuralism, that it is also generative, right? That it is precisely because it is, and that's kind of Nietzsche's idea about prisoners of language as well, that you think precisely because you are incarcerated. It is not an either-or situation, right? So it is precisely because we use binaries and precisely because there is a finite number of relations that meanings can be made. That's why structure is generative, not restrictive. So obviously it doesn't block. It actually encourages, makes possible, enables the next elaboration. Right? I'll stop there.
There is just one other question, which we'll quickly take up.
So this is a little bit of an ill-formed question, but bear with me. So I was thinking that, you know, yesterday you and I were joking about metaphors and the overemphasis on metaphors. But what is the role of metaphor in that text that you read so closely? And I was wondering, because it made me think of the way that the structure is being imagined through the carceral here. And then if you look at Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropic, it's always open fields, flowers in the open field, lovely flowers blooming here, there. So it's almost the opposite. So the way Levi-Strauss is understanding, so maybe at that level, there's no carceral, there's this like open field is the metaphor somehow, and the perfectness of the flower, etc. And here it is something else is going on. So is it that in delving deeper, is there something more to be done on the surface of this language? With the kind of, and the carceral that you're talking of, the, like what is, you of course sidestepped it, and I'm with you on that, that not wanting to define what is structuralism, but what is structure. But whenever we use the word, we have some image in mind. And the fact that there is a carceral image here, that is what is different from the open field or the flower. And so is there a metaphoric to also be brought into this analysis of the way you're thinking of sensibility. Maybe, I don't know about sensibilities, maybe I was thinking that it's such a lyrical text that, and metaphors are doing a very important job there of kind of defining what the structure is. Yeah, so I'm not sure that is a question or an observation.
I would just quickly, or I don't need microphone. You know, in older days, you also didn't need it when we used to address the GBs, but you have grown older. No, I take your point, and I would say that it is kind of what I find interesting in this particular instance is there both the axes, the metonymic axis and the metaphorical axis, are actually at play together, right? It is kind of, it's obviously there is a lot of, I drew the final metaphor between prison house of language and this, and Guha didn't do that, right? But he is definitely talking also about it's eventually a metonymic move, right? That the prison and the society, it's that relationship is almost kind of synecdochal, right? So in a certain sense, I think it is, you are right, that this is a very idiomatic figurative text. But I think I wanted to seize on quite intentionally on that particular moment because, you know, Project, why I should clarify this, because I've been reading a lot about the history of structuralism, and you know, many of you I'm sure know a lot has been written on it, but most of it is about like how this Yale professor invited that Frenchman and what kind of sauce they had, which kind of, you know, is fine for page 3 academic news, but I do think that why Mudimbe, for example, took to structuralism so hastily and sometimes kind of, you know, kind of suicidally, but he did take to it. You know, Diop is getting some kind of I think there is a story to be told, which has completely. Exactly. No, absolutely. And this is just a provocative genealogy. This is not the. I'm not saying that this is the route through which it came. I'm just saying this is one way of thinking about an alternative genealogy.
Mane, sorry, but I suddenly remember that we have done this kind of an exercise with Marxism itself, right? Vernacular Marxism, blah, blah, blah. Multiple histories of structuralism. Foucault's many lives.
He's a cat.
I mean, I'm just saying, I mean, can we set the terms of our own debate, please, also, at some point? And read Ranajit Guha as Ranajit Guha rather than as a Marxist, structuralist, Pathoda as a Foucauldian, blah, 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 as a... I mean, we read everybody, so we love Foucault, we love, you know. I'm just saying, I'm like, I love you, but I'm just saying, but let's also set the terms of the debate.
Can I respond to that? I would just quote Deleuze and say, each of us is several, so already there's quite a crowd in Ranajit Guha.
I would like to have the last word to end the session, please. But not break for tea. We have another session right now, and then tea, please.
Yes, and there is no escape from the prison house of paneling. You are the chair for this session. So there is, the carceral continuum stays. Okay.